Right, ladies and gentlemen, please give a warm welcome to Mr. Joshua Walker. He's with us here from Washington, where he is the head of global initiatives in Japan for the Eurasia group. And he has quite a resume, in 2017, he was the head of the American Pavilion at the World Expo in Kazakhstan. He's founding dean of the APCO, the Global Strategic Communications Firm. Correct? Yep. Correct. Previous to that, he's held positions in the State Department and the Department of Defense. And when he wasn't doing that, he's teaching at George Mason University. And when you're not doing that, you're a transatlantic fellow at the German Marshall Fund. Yes. Along with degrees from Richmond, Yale, and Princeton. Yeah. And you're here today to speak on Japan's role in a G0 world. Mm-hmm. So, without further ado, take it away, please, sir.
Thank you very much. I'm really excited to be here. I feel guilty because I'm kind of talking over you eating, but the good news is that I hopefully can put some figurative food for thought in my first few minutes on the table for you. And the first thing I should say is I should apologize. Coming from Washington, I feel like I have to go around the world doing an apology tour to basically say I'm sorry for the chaos that we have created. And I'm not talking about President Trump. I'm talking about the role that the U.S. has traditionally played has fundamentally changed. The one good news is I think that Japan may be one of the few places in the world that I can actually come and you might actually be a beneficiary. Now, in the relative sense, it may not necessarily be a good thing in the long run that we can talk about. But what I'd like to do is kind of spend the 15 or 20 minutes that I want to share with you to kind of lay out some of my thinking. I think oftentimes when speakers come into Tokyo, they have a much more narrow focus and they focus to a Japanese audience. I'd like to actually broaden it. And I think it's actually appropriate because when I was growing up in Japan over 30 years ago, Japan's role was very clear. You were America's little brother. Your role was to kind of help with the U.S.-Japan alliance, to keep stability, to be the cornerstone, foundation, whatever terminology we have. Now, actually, because not only of your prime minister, which I think we can talk about, Prime Minister Abe's personality and his personal relationships, in a world in which personalities matter more than ever in geopolitics, Prime Minister Abe has seemingly found the very best of Japan, whether it's as Super Mario and bringing Olympics to Japan, or whether it's his diplomacy with strongmen around the world, from Vladimir Putin to Recep Tayyip Erdogan or Bibi Netanyahu or President Trump himself, who's just left here, obviously. But I think it's also because of the world in which we're living. And the idea of the G0 world that Ian Bremmer, my boss, came up with 10 years ago, at the time, seemed a little bit forward-thinking, to be very diplomatic. It seemed that he was, when Obama came to power, we all thought this is really the end of history, right? We have the first African-American president, the first president that doesn't look like me. The world is all right. We have had all these problems in our past. I'm from the South of America. We have a lot of things to atone for in my part of the country, particularly in Virginia with the scandals we have. But I think that we had this optimism. And at that moment of optimism, Ian was writing about the breakdown of the international system. And I think what he saw, and I think what Japan understood intuitively, and the reason Ian's ideas have caught on probably more so in Japan than any other place around the world, is because Japan felt this. It felt the winds of change. And while the United States is still a superpower, it's still a predominant force, the question of whether it's a force for good is now being questioned very openly. And the question of whether the President of the United States and the United States are actually putting their own interest above all others in a way that President Trump has very articulately put out, America first, right? Does America first mean America only? Right? And I think there is no country around the world that does not pursue its own policies. But I think that the question that President Trump has raised very acutely in the American political system is, can America thrive by being part of the world, or can America thrive by detaching itself from the world? Japan's answer is very clear, right? Japan has no choice. Demographically, historically, you are part of this region. And even after the defeat of World War II, your choice to join the West, to join international institutions, to be kind of a founding member of peace and stability has been very clear. Now, the question is, can you continue as you get put increasingly between two of the largest powers? As the US and China compete in every sphere, not just geopolitically, geoeconomically, and geotechnology-wise, but will Japan be forced to make choices? Because if you're forced to make choices, it's very clear that the US-Japan alliance will make Japan into a European, American bastion in a way that we don't see in Europe. And I think that debate is raging right now. And that debate is raging not because of American foreign policy per se, but it's because of the international environment itself. Donald Trump is not the cause of all evil in the world. He's not the problem. He's a symptom, right? He's the same symptom as Brexit that he's discussing right now in Britain. He's the same symptom as the populist right-wing movements we've seen everywhere else. In fact, if you had told me 2 years ago that the strongest, and I define strongest as someone that actually has consensus within his own country, leader of the G7 would be the Japanese Prime Minister, I would have laughed at you. Number one, I would have said the Japanese Prime Minister doesn't matter. Japan is a strong state system, and therefore, as a result, whoever the Prime Minister is is irrelevant. His personality is not as important. But I think particularly with the national security reforms that we've seen in Japan, the National Security Council that has kind of tamed some of the institutional rivalries we have seen between METI, MOFA, other challenges, we've seen Prime Minister Abe take advantage of that. And also, of course, at the same time, you have an American president who spends more time attacking his opponents domestically when he travels abroad, and the kind of old saying that the kind of foreign policy begins at the water's edge and we don't deal with domestic politics when we're overseas has broken down. Now, that's not unique to Trump. That was something that many presidents have done, but there is kind of a protocol or decorum that has broken down, and we saw that both currently in Britain, we saw it in Japan as well. As he was watching sumo, as he was meeting the emperor, he was tweeting about Joe Biden and kind of having comments about Chairman Kim. So I think that is something that is unique, and I think that means that Japan has a unique role to play in that. I look at Japan as kind of being a great friend of the United States precisely because you're able to both understand us, not threaten us, and also work with us. Japan doesn't have ambitions to be a superpower. It knows very clearly that its place in Asia will always be in the shadow of China. The question is, what can it do for the international system to figure out how to either A, integrate and engage China, or contain and confront China? And that's a debate that's been raging in Japan since the 1990s under Fukuda and otherwise. And I think what we are going through, the United States with China, is a much larger scale version of that. Now, we can have a conversation about what the trade war between the US and Japan in the 80s might teach us about currently, but I think they're fundamentally different beasts. When you're talking about an ally and two democracies versus two very different systems, and what a regime in China and Beijing looks like versus what the regime in Washington looks like, they're two very different things. Now, add into this mix Prime Minister Abe and his very enthusiastic embrace of foreign policy. And I'm not naive enough to believe that it's just out of the goodness of his heart. I believe it has to do with domestic Japanese politics, right? Why is Prime Minister Abe going to Iran? I think it has to do with kind of showing a very good picture to the Japanese public of shaking hands and being able to be the first prime minister to meet with a leader of Iran since 1978. And also a feeling, I think, that Prime Minister Abe has that his interlocutor in Iran is not the right person. And if he wants to meet the grand leader himself, Supreme Leader Khomeini, he has to go to Iran because Khomeini cannot leave Iran because of international sanctions. As a result, Prime Minister Abe's trip that we hear will be happening, I don't know if it's been officially announced or not, but we can talk about it, June 12th through 14th, will be fascinating. And I think that when you think about the many attempts that America has had to mediate its relations between the Islamic Republic of Iran since 1979, we've looked to the Swiss, we've looked to the Omanis, we've even looked to the Obama administration with the JCPOA and the Iran deal to mitigate this for us. But we haven't been successful. So Japan is squarely putting itself in the middle. The good news is, unlike Americans, Japanese have very low expectations. No one believes that Prime Minister Abe will go and fix it on his own, but somehow the message that he will be delivering from President Trump, that there is an openness and an eagerness to embrace an unorthodox type of foreign policy, the same way we saw with Chairman Kim that led to the meetings both in Singapore and then Hanoi after it, is something that I think Donald Trump has a particular appetite for as a deal maker. And so if one deal doesn't go well, he looks for another one. He does not get stuck up on the details of these things. And so I think what's interesting about that is Abe-san is putting himself on the one hand, in a global position to go and have this meeting, and then right after that, he will come back and host the G20 here, where we'll have some very exciting meetings, hopefully, between the US and Chinese presidents as they try to come to some type of agreement about our current dispute over trade and technology and our systems, but also between Vladimir Putin and between Recep Tayyip Erdogan or between MBS of Saudi Arabia. It's very fascinating to look at Abe because he's able to pretty much of all the G20 leaders, he can claim, I think, to have the best relations with all of them collectively, which I don't think any European leader, and certainly the US president, cannot say. Because the US president probably has better relations with the countries that are so-called authoritarian strongman than he does with his European counterparts because of differences on policy, because of the US pulling out of the Paris Climate Accord, because of the US pulling out of TPP, the US being seen to be retreating on the global stage in certain ways, but also having a very different, more blunt swagger, as they call it in Washington these days. And so I think that this allows a space for Japan to operate. Now, it's a very uniquely Japanese type of leadership, right? Japanese leadership is not by beating the chest and kind of standing on the global stage and declaring things. It's more of a soft type of diplomacy. It's an insinuation type of diplomacy. It's the Indo-Pacific, free and open Indo-Pacific, a data governance with trust. These ideas that sound innocuous enough, but if they are adopted by other nations, by the Europeans, by the Americans, Japan can credibly claim to be putting something in place that actually could be the beginning of a new architecture. Not architecture in the sense of a new P5 or UN or WTO, but I do think it gives us a place to have that conversation. I mean, the G20 is a talking shop. When I was at the State Department running some of those negotiations in the G20, we didn't necessarily look at those as being where breakthroughs would happen. It was an opportunity for finance ministers to discuss the crisis that had enveloped us 20 years before, and it was an opportunity to recast what was going on. And the so-called Washington Consensus, which now I believe is under attack in terms of what Washington's role looks like, what the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, what our alliance structures more broadly look like. Are they paying dividends to the US taxpayer? Are they bringing enough benefit to us? A very nationalistic, populist view of the world, something I disagree with on a personal level, but I certainly understand it as an American citizen. And I think one of the challenges is that America in general is very different than Japan. Tokyo represents everything, right? With the exception, and with respect to my friends from Osaka or Kyoto that could credibly claim to have other things, this is your financial, your cultural, it's your everything capital, political. Washington is only our political capital. New York is our financial capital. San Francisco is our innovation capital. LA arguably is our cultural capital. Houston's energy. Chicago's agri. I mean, I go through the list, right? So therefore, power is becoming less centralized. And I think that in a G0 world, this paradigm shift that we see from the nation state more to the kind of state level and then also the company level, individual agency is particularly important. And I think in that case, Japan, in some ways, is a unique position. You have a homogeneous population that more or less has a consensus about your place. You may be shrinking demographically, but in a world in which the workforce is less and less relevant in terms of numbers of people, it's about how do you produce value. And in a service economy, that creates the new ideas. So whether it's TPP or what my boss has recently talked about in terms of the digital TPP, there's a lot of opportunity out there. So I see Japan uniquely positioned for that in a way that perhaps we would not have predicted in the past. Now, we can talk about all the problems. The great thing about Japanese are, instead of taking all this and saying, thank you very much, we appreciate our role, you're going to tell me, well, we're actually pretty weak on this. Our R&D is pretty bad. We don't have any technology companies. We are really behind the curve, which is absolutely the case. But I guess my argument is not necessarily to say that Japan is #1, as maybe people argued in the 80s and 90s. But I would argue that this is Japan's global moment. And the moment is not necessarily for Japan to shape the agenda, but it's to be the place where the agenda is shaped. And I think that whatever happens in Japanese politics, there's a big disconnect, I think, between the way that I feel when I come to Tokyo, which is that people are a little bit tired of the current prime minister and that they would like the prime minister to kind of, move on. But the question is, who comes next? There does not seem to be an immediate alternative. And I think from a global perspective, it's the exact opposite, because most Americans or Europeans, they now have become very comfortable and they know who Abe is. And whoever you put forward next will, by definition, not be as global, because the number of meetings that Abe has had, the 26 with Putin, the countless number with all the world leaders. The trouble with democracies tends to be that we rotate our leaders much quicker. And so we don't have the longevity that some of the authoritarian states enjoy. And that does lead to difficulties on the international system because these leaders develop over time. Even the greatest American presidents, the greatest Japanese prime ministers, whether it's Reagan or Nakasone or Yoshida or Koizumi or go through the list, they learned on the job and they became better usually over time. And so I think that's where Abe has this kind of ability of having spent so much time with international leaders that maybe sometimes the tatemae doesn't appear at first to be very important, but that ability to kind of have small talk, that ability to connect and to kind of make these connections is particularly important. So I think I've probably gone longer than I said I would, so I want to stop there because I know that there's probably a lot of questions, and I'm also very aware, I see both Japanese and others in the room. I learned the hard way at Todai that sometimes Japanese are not the first to put their hands up like the Chinese are. You have to kind of look at people's eyes, and so given that I see all of your eyes at different points of time, I know you must have questions, so I'll turn it over and go whatever direction you would like me to go.
Thank you very much. And for the question round, again, as our speaker said, if you have a question, please put your hand up, introduce yourself and your publication, if any. Thank you very much. Sir?
Hi. Hi, my name is Reed Stevenson from Bloomberg. The most interesting curveball, I think, is the Mexico tariffs. And based on our reporting, I don't think a lot of Japanese companies saw that coming, given the intricacy of the supply chain, the car factories in Mexico, et cetera. I mean, just give us your analysis of that, and how do you think it's going to play out over, it was 150 days or so?
Yeah.
150 days?
I mean, this is the hardest thing in Washington because back in my day, and this sounds like I should be an old guy saying this, but there was something called the Interagency Process, which is when the different agencies would come together and try to implement the president's prerogatives. Here, at least at the reporting, because I've been here the whole time, I have not been in Washington to talk to my sources, it appears that the president made this decision more out of frustration and more out of just irritation than out of a policy prerogative. And I think that process, and at least from the reporting I've read, a lot of his key advisors were against this idea because they realized that when you put Mexico in the position you're putting them in, what more can they really do? I mean, the way in which the president has defined success is very nebulous, right? It's his discretion. If Mexico does enough, what does that mean to stem? And linking the economic and using kind of a big bazooka like tariffs on something that is a more targeted, micro, laser-focused policy decisions like immigration. I mean, this is where the president has a penchant for kind of focusing on the big picture without worrying about the details. Yeah, I mean, if I was a Japanese company, I'd be very annoyed right now because I've already got my own issues dealing with, let's just take car companies, for example, right? You've already got the threat of 232 and the US-Japan tariff situation. And now you're basically saying that NAFTA itself is, which we thought we had overcome with 2.0, is now under threat. And then on top of that, you're going to levy, kind of tariffs on Mexico. Does that include Japanese car manufacturers whose supply chains are intricate linked? The answer is no one knows, right? And the problem is if you go to USTR and talk to Lighthouser, he's got a lot of things on his plate these days, right? Not least of which is China. And then at the same time, you have Treasury, and you have Commerce, and you have the State Department, you have the Defense Department, you have the Justice Department, you have the White House National Security Council, the National Economic Council. I mean, there are so many players that really, on the one hand, none of them matter. It matters the president. On the other hand, the implementation of that is done at the sub-level. So I think today in Washington, on Wednesday, I guess, so by the time I land back in Washington, the trade negotiators will be meeting from Mexico, and they are desperately trying. I mean, what's funny about this is the Mexican president has been one of the most accommodating of all the leaders. He has not at all been belligerent. He has not at all taken the line that the former Mexican presidents have taken, basically saying, you can insult us, but we need you. We'll work together. So I'm also a little baffled by it. And the timing of it seems to be particularly difficult. And I think one thing that we know is that President Trump seems to enjoy keeping people on their toes. If there's a grand strategy here, I don't necessarily see it.
I mean, the traditional levers that Japan can use in a situation like this, I can't think of it.
Yep.
But can you? I mean, what can Japan do?
I mean, what Japan can do is pick up the phone. I mean, Abe has a personal relationship with Donald Trump. It is very striking. I like to think about counterfactuals. What would have happened if this had happened while Trump was in Japan, right? So instead of you having disagreements about North Korea and kind of what counts as a ballistic versus a violation of the UN, which we can parse out, it would have been interesting because I do believe that Prime Minister Abe probably would not have directly challenged the president, but I have to imagine that behind the scenes he would explain to the president how this could be bad for for the American economic point of view, and then also from a global economic point of view. But you're right. I mean, as much as I would like to promote Japan's global role in this particular arena, the best that Japanese companies can do is voice their displeasure, and then that gets complicated because if they voice their displeasure in the way Toyota did, what does that mean for the Japanese government's relationship with a president that is uniquely thin-skinned and takes everything very personally?
Next question, please. Yes, sir.
My name is Kurt Sieber. I'm an associate member. Thank you very much for your talk. You mentioned in your presentation that Japan is getting tired of Prime Minister Abe. On what kind of observations are you basing this type of fact here? Yeah. Or is it fact? Is it not fact? I mean, there are different opinions, but as you point out, at least it is very divided, because even among the people who are voting for Abe and LDP, 50% are voting for a lack of other alternatives. Thank you so much.
Yeah, you're putting me on a difficult spot, because anytime you talk in these terms, you get yourself in a little bit of trouble. So I first will say it is not a fact. It is an observation. It's what I feel. It's the atmosphere. It's the fuinki. And also this comes from understanding at least what I think is Japanese culture, which is in most countries, longevity, and I think in Japan in particular, is respected. However, the prime minister's role should be rotated, right? And there should be balance between the factions. And so we thought that maybe under the new system, Abe would somehow transcend factionalism, which he has on the global sense, but I get the feeling that there is a sense that, okay, Abenomics and a lot of the domestic promises of Abe that have been much more difficult to realize. The international is actually the exception to the rule. Internationally, Abe has delivered over, I would argue, but on the domestic side, with the consumption tax coming, with the discussion, I mean, let me be very frank, and let me get myself in too much more trouble. In Washington last month, when Suga-san came through, I was absolutely surprised. I could not fathom the number of people that began to talk about Chief Cabinet Secretary Suga as being Prime Minister. Now, I understand the symbolism of Mr. Reiwa. I get it, right? This is Obuchi all over again, where somehow the man behind the curtain will step forward and be the savior that the Japanese are looking for, because in some ways, the discussion I hear is that Suga-san represents a continuation of Abe's policies without Abe the individual, right? Which makes no logical American sense, because from an American point of view, well, he wants to be the longest serving prime minister and his relationships are what matter. But in the Japanese context, there is a societal norm, I would argue, and so that's where my observation is coming. And I think that your point is very well taken, which is that there is an appetite for an alternative, but there is no alternative. It's a little bit like the US right now. A lot of people don't like Trump. More people dislike Trump than they like Trump, but there is no alternative. And until the Democrats can come together and decide who their alternative is, and if those Democrats cannot come together, and the Sanders supporters will not support Biden, who I think will be the nominee, but anything can happen. American politics can change. So I guess that's where I get that feeling. And I also get the feeling that if you had asked me a month ago what the likelihood of a double election in Japan would have been, I would have said 5%. Seems unlikely. It doesn't make any logical sense. It still seems unlikely, but now it feels like it's at 20 or 30%. And I think that is the type of thing that begins to make incumbents a little bit scared. And the main rivals begin to start angling. And I'm not talking about Ishiba, right? Ishiba has made it very clear his ambitions. The question is there a credible alternative? I was in Washington a couple weeks ago during Golden Week when Koizumi Jr. came and gave a speech. the speech was not targeted at an American audience. It was very clearly targeted back here. And that's been the traditional way this works. Golden Week, most people are not around in Washington, but they need to have delegations coming from Tokyo to then parade and show their international credentials that then give them the ability to come back. So if the alternative between Abe and Koizumi Jr. is not attractive, what do we do? Either Abe has to go for a 4th term, or you have to have some type of Suga type scenario. And that to me is where I step out of my comfort zone into the area that all of you are much more experts on. But that's where I get some of my thinking on this.
Sir, in front here, please.
Yoshio Murakami, I'm the regular member here. I agree.
Are you with a publication, sir?
I'm advisor to the New York Times International Edition in Japan.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. Besides what the Western world looks at Abe and they're comfortable with Abe, and the Japanese situation, I think yours is mostly absolutely correct, your observation. I think the only chance that we would have some kind of a hope for the future prime minister, we would have to wait till Koizumi Jr. would come in. But look, just objective analysis is where I differ from you, and that is he has no accomplishment whatsoever of his over 65, 67 diplomatic trips around the world, burning 240 barrels of
oil.
Fuel for his Boeing jet. But anyway, let's see. Meeting 25 times with Vladimir Putin, what he got is a difficulty to say, as a Japanese, Northern Territory, which people have been doing frequently before his diplomacy. And meeting for 25 times, 20 times, including golf with Trump, he hasn't really got anything. We still have a tremendous problem in Okinawan military base and also coming up with the trade issue. In other words, I think the Japanese do not see why he is sort of a successful prime minister. And he promised that Abe cabinet is the one which is going to solve this kidnap case with the North Korea. He has never even had any chance whatsoever.
Sir, do you have a question, sir?
No, what I'm saying is the observation, objective observation, is that he should not be valued as some even effective leader.
Yeah, and I think this is where I think Japanese are extremely hard on their leaders, because my feeling on this is the expectation level for Japanese is very low. But you're right to point out that probably in the last successive years of Koizumi and Nakasone, you could point to specific things that they got. The Nakasone relationship with Reagan and Thatcher led to direct economic growth in Japan that benefited everyone. Koizumi's very close relationship with George Bush led to Japan's more global role in Iraq and Afghanistan, etc. I would simply say that Abe has inherited a more difficult international environment. And you're right to point to the North Korean abductee issue as the one major international win that he could secure. But the fact that President Trump met with the leaders, the abductee families, and nodded his head and didn't have a major gaffe is maybe a win. And I think that it's also too soon to tell, because I actually believe that whether it's the winning of the Tokyo Olympics or the World Expo in 2025, these things matter. Now, they may not matter in the same context for you as a Japanese citizen or a voter to say, I put Abe here, I want more. And maybe some other prime minister can deliver more by being more aggressive and not as cautious and risk averse as Prime Minister Abe. But there are other things that I would point to, whether it's the EU-Japan free trade zone, whether it's this idea of kind of data governance, privacy, some type of forming. And I just believe that it's too soon to tell, but I take your point, and this is where we have a healthy conversation about objective versus kind of like what would your expectation, because I tend to believe that if you have high expectations and you deliver here, people will be dissatisfied. Whereas if you keep expectations here and you only deliver this, it doesn't actually mean that you're a failure. And I think that's what Abe you're describing. He may tell people, I can do this. I have a very low expectation for him, so therefore I have a much lower threshold. So maybe I'm a little too optimistic from a Japanese, so I accept that.
Thank you. Sir, first you, sir, and then, yeah. Okay, thank you very much.
Tokumoto, I'm a freelance for Japanese weekly magazine. My question is about Mr. Trump. Mr. Trump, he had a press conference here in 1992 at the FCCJ, and I listened to the audio tape, and he talked about Japan's economic threat and the bubble economy and protectionism and how it's damaging American automobile makers. Yep. And my impression is Mr. Trump is still in 1980s. Not 2019. So how can we bring him back to the 21st century from 1980s? My impression is he is still obsessed with his image and his observations more than 30 years ago. So how can we bring him back to the real world? And the second question is, could you tell us more about your observation of Mr. Suga? Chief Cabinet Secretary. Every time I listen to his press conference, he has a press conference, two press conferences every day, but I cannot understand what he's talking about. Every time we ask a tough question, his answer is almost the same. There's no problem. 問題ない。それは当たらない。So I cannot understand his, as a politician, how can you observe Mr. Suga?
Yeah, let me start with the last one. They're both difficult questions and will get me in trouble either way because you're asking me to comment on things that will inevitably be interesting. I met Suga-san for the first time in 2012, kana? So it was during the DPJ time, and it wasn't during the, it was not 3/11. I was doing research for my project at Todai, or maybe it was 2010. It was, I think it was before the disaster. And it was taken to him by a friend who said, look, here's a guy that is very capable and has kind of an incredibly sunny disposition, which is not a word I would use to describe the current Suga-san I see, but I have not seen him in a long time. I was very impressed by him. Now, obviously, he doesn't speak English, so of course his viewpoints on things is very domestically focused. But he's an appetite for curiosity. So my impression from that point, and now as I watch him, he is the real secret ingredient in my mind to Prime Minister Abe's prime ministership, because he is the one that behind the scenes is able to make sure that the politics are in place for Prime Minister Abe, and I think that takes a lot of skill. And whether or not he's going to step on to the stage himself, or whether he will prefer to stay behind the scenes, is an interesting question that I'm far not qualified to answer. But I think that your point about him not answering questions is probably a pretty common political dealing in any country. The challenge is, in the current environment, is there any benefit of being open and transparent? Because with the 24-hour news cycle, there is probably a better role for the media to use, Prime Minister Suga's, kind of truthfulness to come back to hurt him. And that leads me to Donald Trump. You don't get a reality TV star president without a president that understands that taking more extreme positions will get you more attention. I think actually President Trump, we talk about Trump's unpredictability. I actually think Trump is probably one of the most predictable presidents in U.S. history. He's unpredictable compared to the U.S. establishment, what we expect him to do. But if you follow him, as you have just laid out, over the last 30 years, he's been amazingly consistent, right? What is in his interest? What is his ideas? Stay very clear. He doesn't really change his mind on things. He simply is flexible. President Trump could have very easily been a Democrat. He could have taken over the Democratic Party, just like he took over the Republican Party. The problem is a lot of Democrats live in New York City. A lot of them don't like President Trump. Republicans didn't know much about him other than his image of being a successful business tycoon, of being a real estate agent who was able to have his own TV show. So I don't know if it's realistic to try to bring a 70-something-year-old man into a new reality, because I believe, the old saying about teaching an old dog a new trick. is particularly appropriate here. And I'm certainly not calling my president a dog. He's the president of the United States. He deserves the respect. But I do believe that he has been unbelievably consistent. And when you look at his choices in the foreign policy establishment on the trade issues, whether it's Peter Navarro, whether it's Bob Lighthouser, whether it's these other individuals, it does reflect a throwback to a time in which American foreign policy and a time in which our trade deficit and discussions were driven by specific indicators. Maybe not holistic indicators in the way that we would like to look at trade imbalances, but I think that this is a challenge and something that Japan is not alone in having to deal with my president on these things.
Thank you. Ma'am, you got a question?
My name is Hanako Jo of the Liberty magazine. Thank you very much for coming. One of the major concerns for the Japanese people is the combined partnership between Russia and China and Russia and North Korea. How deep the relationship between Russia and China, or Russia and North Korea is right now? And because if these powers combine, that is going to be a very security threat for the Japanese people. And what is the really effective way for the Prime Minister Abe and President Trump to drive a wedge between the two countries?
So I'll put my cards on the table. I grew up in Hokkaido. I could literally see Russia from my house, right? That's a joke to Sarah Palin back in the day. I have been a strong proponent of Russian-Japanese relations because I believe historically, when you look at the global system, beginning from the Russo-Japanese War to the contemporary period, that Japan has always seen Russia not as its principal rival, but as a competitor that can be worked with. And I think the Russians actually respect Japan historically in a way that I don't see coming from China. And given the current trends of Russia as a declining power and China as a rising power, it's much easier for Japan to do deals. And this is heightened by Abe's personal history, right? His father is foreign minister, grandfather is prime minister. There's a kind of a Russia school that has become very strong in his inner circle. So my first point would be that as a scholar of international relations, not as an American DC insider, it strikes me that we, the United States, has done a very poor job of highlighting the differences between the Russians and Chinese, right? Yesterday was the 30-year anniversary of Tiananmen Square. Before that, there was a big split led by Nixon and Kissinger that led to the splitting of the communist world, that led to American viewpoint that China was somehow going to become more like us, right? And the debate has been raging since the end of the Cold War about how to get China to be more like us. We believe that by including them in the international system, they would somehow become more like us. I would argue we are actually becoming more like them. We can have a discussion about what that means. But that means that the Russia-Chinese rapprochement right now is mostly because of the lack of Western embrace of Russia and also American foreign policy towards these two adversaries, right? I think Russia's invasion of Ukraine, its interference in Syria and now in Venezuela is basically filling a vacuum that America has left, right? Ukraine was beginning to go towards the West and look towards EU membership, NATO membership. I think it's clear if Ukraine was a NATO member, we would not have had that challenge. But now the debate about how NATO expansion has threatened Putin himself and the Russian people is something we're now debating 30 years after the collapse of the Soviet Union. And I think the challenge here is, in the US, because of the election interference in 2016, there is not a political consensus on what to do with Russia. President Trump has a very different viewpoint on Vladimir Putin in particular than anybody else in his administration. There is a bipartisan consensus on the challenge that Russia represents, but there's an even stronger one on China. So just because these two countries represent challenges to the international system and a threat to American interest does not mean we can't separate these two. And here I think the Europeans play a particularly large role. The way that Japan looks at China as a principal threat, the way it's been described to me is dragon with a fire breath on Japan, whereas the Europeans look at the bear with an open jaw. They have a different approach. right? Like the Germans would like to bring Russia back in by using energy security as a way to have a conversation. The British would like to punish interference in a very legalistic way when it comes to the spies, etc. And France has always had a more unique perspective. And the EU as a whole has a different set of mechanisms with a neighbor than we do with our adversary across the way in Eurasia. I believe this is going to play out in two places in competition. You introduced me as having lived in Kazakhstan for a while. In Kazakhstan, nobody likes their big brother, right? They lived with the Soviet Union for a long time. They just recently, Nazarbayev has stepped down. Their elections are this Sunday. They don't want to replace their big brother. China would like to replace Russia, but they're not doing it through military or security policy. They're doing it through economics. Kazakhstan is described as the buckle of the belt, right? They would like an alternative. They like when Japan came and created the C5+1 and America copied them and now we have a new Silk Road, but there was nothing behind it. There was no substance behind it. And so I think in Central Asia, the competition between Russia and China will get more heated, right? When it comes to Muslim extremism, that has already led to terrorism in Russia, and when it comes to a threat in Xinjiang, there's a unity between Russia and China. They will work with the authoritarian regimes of this region to suppress this. But when it comes to economic well-being and freedom, whether it's the Eurasian Union that the Russians promote, or whether it's a Shanghai Cooperation Organization that the Chinese promote, or the Belt and Road Initiative, there's a big divide here. And I think increasingly China is going to be dragged into international arenas, particularly in the Middle East, right? As the US begins to take a bigger and bigger step back to focus on our own internal problems and our own internal politics, it means that China will find itself increasingly, as it tries to create this Belt and Road from Asia to Europe, it is going to find itself ensnared in this. And I think that right now they find common cause against the international system. But I think if we had more creative diplomacy in the West, and I'm not blaming just the United States, I'm looking at the Europeans as well, I'm looking at the Japanese, we have to find a way of working together, because this, in my mind, is not a natural alliance. It's more of a circumstantial one.
Thank you very much. Sir, in the back, please.
Thank you for your presentation. My name is Jiro Abe. Associate member of this club, 25 years since 1995. By the way, my Abe is spelled differently.
Okay, I was going to ask if you were related.
Abe. You know, that Abe we call double cheap. The cheap, double like cheap. Yeah. My Abe is different. My question is very simple. I'm not familiar with the G0. Mm-hmm. Can you describe what's the definition of G0?
Sure.
Thank you.
Thank you. I think that this fits directly in the book that Ian wrote called Every Nation for Itself. The G0 basically is a leaderless world, and it's a direct play or parody on the G7 and the G20. So the G7 and the G20 is to basically put countries together that will somehow drive the system. So whether it's the 70% of the economic output or whether it's 95%, the G0 basically says, look, it doesn't matter what the United States and China would like to do. By themselves, they cannot influence it. What it means that, for example, the climate change is not something that America by itself can alter anymore. It's not something that China by itself. Yes, of course, in a G2 world between China and the US, they may agree on things, but as I just was talking about with Russia, whether it's Russia or whether it's the Europeans, they have a say here. And I think that it is a unique moment because, you know, throughout history there have been empires. There have been nation states that are first among equals, and whether it's the P5 that in the post-World War II environment have defined the international order, there is something that's changing. And many people thought after the end of at the end of Cold War, we might live in a G1 world where America was the predominant unipolar moment, is what we called it. But increasingly, we find ourselves in a world of regions. And so what it means is that in Asia, China and the US are directly locked in competition, where the US or China by itself cannot change the power balance. But at the same time, America cannot dominate the entire system, whether it's in Eurasia or other areas. And we're even being challenged in the Western Hemisphere, which since the Monroe Doctrine in the 19th century, we've not been challenged. Now we're directly being challenged right now by what's happening in Venezuela, and what's happening in Latin America. So the G0 is very much about the leaderless world. The other piece to this, as I think I mentioned, is it's less and less about nation states, and it's increasingly more about societies, about how people organize. And that's not something that we take for granted. In other words, just because nation states have defined all of our lifetimes does not mean that is the only structure moving forward. Tokyo is a great example, right? This is a growing, thriving megapolis, even though the countryside of Japan is being drained of all of its talent coming here. So therefore, Tokyo actually in some ways on its own has a better chance of having diplomacy between the megacities of the world, right? Whether it's between New York or Istanbul or Jakarta, this actually, there are many people that would prefer. I sometimes joke that there's more we have in common between New York and DC and Tokyo than between DC and Kansas or Iowa. You know, or between Tokyo and Hokkaido. You know, when I'm in Hokkaido, I feel more comfortable with Alaska sometimes than I do with New York or Tokyo. And so I think that system that's changing means that the world and the way we as human beings are interacting with one another, the way we organize ourselves is changing. Now, I certainly don't think Ian, he talked very specifically about every nation for itself. So I don't think we're talking about a breakdown in the short term, but I do think there is an open question. The system that was created after World War II is no longer working. It's certainly not working for Americans in the way we would like it to. That's why Donald Trump was elected. How are we going to fix it? Is it going to be small changes to the WTO, small changes to the UN, maybe we'll include a few more members of the Permanent Security Council, or is it going to be more drastic? And what will catalyze that? What will cause that? Is it going to be another world war? I hope not. I hope we learned our lessons, and I think as we celebrate D-Day, as we think about the history of the U.S.-Japan alliance that's led very much from the history, I hope we don't have to relearn those lessons. But increasingly, when I look at my students and I poll them, they would prefer an authoritarian system if they get economic benefit than having a free and open system that makes their life more complicated. That's disturbing to me. That's the G0 world we're in.
That is disturbing and worrying. Sir?
My name is Yutaka Hokura, Associate Member. Thank you very much. And my question is, lately I find some observation that China might lower the level of U.S. federal fund or fund as a kind of retaliation. And if China takes such kind of action, what would be the impact? Thank you.
So since I've been in Japan, everybody at the government level has wanted to know what is America's strategy on China. Because the decision on Huawei seemingly came out of nowhere. And I think it's directly related to what you're asking. And I think you're asking about the fiscal policy and how China, as one of the largest bondholders and one of the largest investors in the United States, is going to use its leverage. Because to put it bluntly, the American president's blunt approach to China, while is shared, the viewpoint of China as an enemy is no longer a debate in the United States. We've crossed that threshold. We have identified China as our principal rival in the world. It is the biggest problem that we have. They are not changing to become like us. Their economic system is not leading them to a free and open system. They are leading them into a firewalled community where basically every citizen is judged by their loyalty to the Communist Party. That is not acceptable from a U.S. perspective. But at the end of the day, they are intricately connected to the international system. And if the Americans decide that we're going to punish national champions like Huawei or Alibaba or Tencent, they have no choice but to retaliate. And one of the mechanisms they can retaliate with is exactly what you laid out. I think that's probably a step too far for them because it will hurt their own economy significantly. I think they're going to first take the rare earth step. They've already shown that they can do it in the past, they'll do it again. It's easy. And it's also very rhetorically nice for them to show. My fear is that the escalation ladder that we talk about in international relations theory generally should have an off-ramp. So both sides can save face. It's very important in Japan to save face, right? We need something to de-escalate the situation. In the current context, the swiftness with which the U.S.-Chinese relations have deteriorated is breathtaking. A month ago, it looked like the U.S. and China were going to be signing a trade deal. Now it seems very far away. But that's also part of the entertainment of reality TV politics right now, where we all get to witness the deal-making capability of the American and Chinese president. And here, they both have an incentive to strike a deal. President Trump needs to get reelected. Xi Jinping needs to keep the Chinese economy growing for his own population. And I think that the idea that the Chinese would sell, I think they will threaten it, for sure. But I think it's more likely that they're going to basically they're going to basically tit for tat. Every time the Americans do something like Huawei, the Chinese will retaliate with FedEx or some other easy target. And they will keep on escalating further and further and further until a deal is struck. And the nice thing here is that the Chinese system is more or less dictated from the top down, so Xi Jinping has absolute control. If he wants a deal and he wants the Chinese to be happy about it, he will tell his media. Donald Trump doesn't have that ability. He will make a deal and he will try to sell it, but there'll be a lot of people that will criticize him for it. And I think that's what Japan is also worried about. So we'll see. But I think that in the escalation scale, what you're describing, if we get to that point, we have much bigger problems in terms of that means that we're not going to strike a deal and we're going to have a much bigger problem on our hands.
Yep, sir.
May I come back to the question about Mr. Abe again? When Mr. Trump came to Tokyo recently, some Japanese tabloid papers said Mr. Abe was doing everything he can do to make Mr. Trump comfortable or happy. In Japanese, gomasuri, appeasing or how can I say?
Yeah.
But anyway, I'm not saying it's good or bad, but the question we should ask is, did he get something in return after doing gomasuri?
Yeah, it's a fair question. Gomasuri has a negative connotation, so I think it is saying it's a negative thing, right? I would use the word omotenashi, right? Which basically anticipates the needs. Now, I don't like that my president only likes hamburgers, right? I would like him to go to a nice sushi restaurant. I would like to appreciate Japanese culture more, but you meet the person where they are. And I think, to be very honest, as someone who did not vote for President Trump, I was incredibly, as a friend of Japan, thought that his attendance of the sumo wrestling match and his tweet with the video of the Twitter of the sumo wrestling was the best thing that's happened to sumo in the last 40 years. I'm a Chiona Fuji guy from Hokkaido, so I'm a little bit biased here because I think he was the best sumo wrestler we've ever seen. But I do think that Japan got something, right? You got global attention. And I think that when it comes to your emperor, the thing that I think Japanese probably still don't fully understand, because most Japanese are more respectful and focus more internally, the world is fascinated by your emperor and by the chrysanthemum throne, because we don't have an imperial system, we don't have a king or queen. And so we are absolutely fascinated. When the British monarchs get married, we have national holidays. When the Japanese emperor changes. And I think there's something uniquely Japanese about the celebration of Reiwa, right? The idea that you go from Heisei, the era of peace, to harmony is actually very telling. Now, obviously, it's somewhat euphemistic and somewhat optimistic. You hope that there will be harmony, right? Just like you hope that there would be peace. So I think that the attention that Japan got from this visit counteracted some of the negative aspects, right? And I think the question is, does the slippers that Donald Trump wore at the sumo matches that were very expensive and look like shoes, or did the president insult your emperor by shaking his hand too hard? The way in which the Empress has now stepped onto the global stage as a Harvard-educated woman of the people, I look at that as a positive thing. I think it gives the global attention. Now, in terms of the gentleman here's point that Abe has not succeeded, I think that there were some tough conversations, I understand, behind the scenes, and that Abe got an earful from the president about car manufacturing and tariffs, et cetera.
I'm asking myself what's the difference between gomasuri and omotenashi. So we got a global attention, but what did we lose?
Well, I have argued in the past that Japan has to be careful of picking sides, because the American system, if you go too far down the path with Trump, then maybe you will be seen as a poodle of the president. Because when you look at the international system, Abe is the only one who still maintains such good relations, right? Macron, Trudeau, everybody originally tried to flatter the president. They tried really hard. But because of policy decisions that the American president took and demonstrated that he has no loyalty ultimately, his loyalty is to himself and to what he believes is in America's interest. Prime Minister Abe is the only one who for 3 years has loyally stood by him. And the question is, will that at some point in time hurt Japan? Up until now, it hasn't. In fact, I think it helps Japan. When Abe goes to Tehran, when Abe goes to Moscow, those leaders are talking to him precisely because they know it's a back channel. If they want to send a message, Abe can pick up the phone whenever he wants. So actually, I think that that relationship has undoubtedly helped Prime Minister Abe on a personal level. Now, it's a different story for Japan. And I think the question of whether Abe stays or goes partly is related to this. I think if there was a strong challenger to Abe right now, Abe's greatest argument against it is, look, if you lose me, you lose Trump. You know, Suga-san does not have the ability, in my opinion, to have the same relationship. However, Suga's trip to Washington showed that somehow, behind the scenes, or maybe very overtly, he is being anointed by Prime Minister Abe to at least be an emissary. And the question is, will that continue if the top is no longer Abe? That's a question I can't answer.
Thank you. Do we have time for one last question? One last question is okay?
Yeah, I see okay. He has an asked question.
Okay, sir. After that, okay. Yes, sir. Go ahead. Thank you very much.
My name is Yuki Arukiho, associate member. Getting back to the China-US issue. Current issue, as you said, went to extreme in comparison with last month. And they touch upon the already national security and the basic China regime issues. What goal of Trump is quite simple, like to make a big deal. In order to make a big deal, he needs some kind of compromise, but we have to support, save his face when he make a compromise. What type of compromise do you think is it possible in coming several months? Issue is quite serious, such as national security or Chinese regime. What do you think about that?
Yeah, a month ago, this was a very easy deal. If you look at Eurasia Group's reporting and some of the work we've done with our analysts who are deep China experts, they tell us that a month ago, it seemed like the deal was struck. A little bit like the Arab-Israeli. We know what the contours of the deal look like. But as you said, neither side was willing to go. And depending on who you talk to, what I understand is that basically the Chinese were not willing to implement anything. So there were 150 pages that were given and 105 pages that came back. At that point in time, Lighthizer went to the president and said, this is not going to work, and the president reacted. You know, the president is a very gut-driven, instinctual man and leader. So now we are in a situation where it will be a much more costly compromise than it would have been a month ago. I think you should expect turbulence. I understand Vice President Pence is going to give a very big address. I actually understand that he was originally planning on giving a speech yesterday, which would have been a disaster. Imagine the vice president going to Hudson again and giving a speech on Tiananmen and talking about Xinjiang and religious freedom. Can you imagine what our friends in Beijing would have done? So it's good that he didn't do that, but I don't think it means he's not going to do that. And I think that this question about Xinjiang and this question about internal discussions in China are going to continue. It is going to be a tool that the U.S. uses against China. And I think everything in President Trump's mind is about leverage. So Huawei, geotechnology, this is all related to this deal. And until he gets the deal he wants, he will use whatever means. I don't know if the Chinese understand that yet, because I think they still think they're dealing with a president that will eventually come around because they think that the long-term benefits are so substantial that they would not disrupt in the short term. I think they're miscalculating.
So just to wrap that up, you think it's going to get worse before it gets better?
Yep. I do. And I think the only question in my mind is not a matter of if, it's a matter of when. And I think that the question here is going to be the timing of when they're able to strike a deal, because President Trump needs a deal by the end of the year for his own electoral cycle. But what happens if, in the meantime, whatever happens leverage-wise leads to a recession in either country? Then both sides have very little room to wiggle. And that's where actually I think that this comes to Japan. If we get into that situation, the United States will need Japan to go first, right? Up until now, Japan, I think, has been hoping that they would be last. We'll have a deal with NAFTA, we'll have a deal with the Europeans, have a deal with the Chinese, and then Japan can be last. What happens if that doesn't happen and Japan is on the firing squad first? You saw what happened to the Koreans. I don't think Japan wants to be in that situation. And while President Trump promised to wait until after the elections will be done in 2 months. So I would say buckle up.
Turbulent times. Thank you so much for your time. That was both enlightening and also slightly worrying, but you know, that's the G0 world.
That's
all
the
over.
world we live in. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks, sir. Appreciate it.